Welcome back to the channel. Chris Morrison, Gulfside Ministries. And in today's video, I would like to look at a debate that recently happened on the Standing for Truth YouTube channel. Link in the description below to this debate between Drew Mack of the Provisionist Perspective and Israel Trujillo. I hope I pronounced your name right, sir, on whether or not the Bible teaches determinism. Now, I want to say up front very quickly, this is not going to be a full debate review. And in fact, I'm not going to play any of the video properly. Instead, we are going to be looking at the Israel's core argument, which we put a lot of stock in. And perhaps I'll do future discussions on determinism more generally, or my thoughts on Drew's response. But having said that, as we ourselves learn how to think and digest arguments, here is the argument that Israel put together. But let me make this larger so that we can all see it more easily. So this is the argument that Israel gave us, that he focused on. And what I want to look at is, first of all, issues around strategy that he chose, and then issues around the argument's clarity and the argument's overall validity. And let me start by saying something about strategy. When I see this argument, just being honest, this feels very overwhelming to me. And just in the world of strategy, there's a cliche that applies here about don't put all your eggs in one basket. When you are having a formal debate, it's not a very good idea to have a single argument, and especially one that is very long, as this is. There are 7 premises here. There's a lot of places that it can go wrong, and as we're going to suggest in a moment, I think there are several places that it does go wrong. I also think, just to be honest, there's something about knowing your audience here, because Standing for Truth YouTube channel is a popular platform. Most of the people who watch it, it's been viewed a couple of thousand times at least, are not professional philosophers. So an argument of this style, it's going to make a lot of people just be frustrated. And we can say, well, but people need to dig down and do and study hard and learn the formal forms of logic. This would be the same thing as if in a biblical debate somebody was doing all sorts of Greek this and Greek that. You have to know your audience, and this is just not an effective mode of presentation. And let me say one final thing about strategy before we move on to the content of the argument. Notice the title of the debate was, "Is Determinism Biblical?" This framing is important because what this allowed Drew to do very properly is just to give 3 or 4 biblical arguments about how we get to make our own free will choices. Now, Israel's argument in response is based on biblical ideas. There's nothing more biblical than Christ. His argument is biblical in the sense that his argument comes out of ideas found in the Bible, but his "in the sense that" is less immediate, less obvious, and less intuitive than Drew's simple arguments. What this meant that Israel needed to do to satisfy the criteria of the debate, as well as just the audience, is he needed to make a framing statement about how his argument is biblical, because this just doesn't seem biblical beyond the fact that it has the word Christ. Drew did, in fact, call Israel on the framing issue, which makes his argument more persuasive. And it means that he gets to, technically speaking, if you hear about scoring, he gets to score the debate in his favor in that regard. But on to the more important stuff. Let's look at the clarity of the actual argument, and let's look at whether or not it actually works. So let's just walk through a couple of, in terms of clarity. The first premise, Christ is one person with 2 wills. This is clear as far as it goes. It's probably not a good place to start, simply because if you are not, again, a formal theologian, this is more surprising than you might think. I will tell you, dear audience, that Israel is right in the sense, I think this is true. This is also the standard view of the church for ever since at least Chalcedon, which is, I mean, this is at this point, this is what the church has always held. This is Chalcedonian Christology. And so if you want to start debating whether or not Christ has 2 wills, this is going to take the debate in a direction that no one wants it to go. So I don't think this is a good place just to start. You actually don't need this premise to get the argument off the ground anyway. So we're not really going to come back to it except in a few minutes to touch on one thing. The real problems are in P's 2, 3, and 4. These are just not clear. What does it mean that Christ's will fully represents the human experience and then fully does so in every way? And what does it mean that if his will has to operate as our human will does. And what does it mean that Christ's will is necessarily aligned with the divine will? These are just not good enough terms to use in a formal debate in terms of phrasing things precisely. All of these terms are open to debate. And Israel may feel like that these are clear terms, but I'm telling you, the people in the audience are confused by them. And I'm rather confused by them. And I know my philosophy and theology very well. They can mean a number of different things. So when you do these sorts of debates, you can't let your statements be open to such interpretation or misinterpretation. In fact, you can just say that premises 1 through 4 are just saying that Christ really is a man, and therefore, however his will operates is just how a human will operates. Now, this lack of clarity by itself is probably reason enough to reject the argument outright, and we would hope that Drew would have a second, third, or fourth argument in his favor, because moreover, Drew and called him on the lack of clarity in the debate, and therefore, from the debate scoring perspective, this is going to be sort of responded to. Israel's going to have to come back and clarify the debate, clarify the argument in the debate, and again, he just doesn't. He's not able to do so, largely because there weren't rebuttals. Another discussion for another day. But now let's come back and look at validity, because this is one of two plays that I think Drew could have hammered Israel a lot more on. And this is what we need to be very aware of as we're both making these sorts of arguments and as we are assessing these sorts of arguments. Now, validity means that whether or not the premises are true, that the conclusion follows. So if I were to give an example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is moral. Notice that the word man connects the two premises so that the conclusion follows. This argument is invalid in at least two ways, and I'm going to argue a third. Notice the first way comes from P1. Christ is one person with two wills. That one person with two wills doesn't occur anywhere else in the argument. It's disconnected, which means nothing follows from it. Fine, get rid of P1 entirely, as I earlier suggested. The more serious problem is in the conclusion. Thus, the Bible affirms determinism. Notice that neither the Bible nor determinism occurs anywhere in the argument, which is to say, just off the top, the argument just does not follow. Now, perhaps this is an easy fix. Notice P7, which is a premise, is kind of a sub-conclusion, is that the human will in general is not free in the libertarian sense. And perhaps Israel just assumes that the human will is not free in the libertarian sense, and determinism is true. But he needs to say that. That by itself is a contested and contestable premise. The point being, he has to make those arguments, and this is his opening statement. So the argument is just invalid as far as it goes. And since it's invalid, you really can't rely on it to quote unquote win your debate. And so I think that Drew should have just scanned it real quickly. Is this even a valid argument? There's no middle terms, therefore it's just not valid. Now, I think there's another issue with P5. I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes. But I think there's another issue of validity that's a lot deeper in the argument. And Israel, feel free to reach out to me if you don't think this is a fair representation. But I think if I try to steelman, if I try to really put Israel's argument in its strongest form, I think this is really much more simply what Israel had in mind. I think what he wants to say is that Christ's will necessarily operates in accordance with a typical human will. That's just what it means to be human. And then I think I'm getting this basically combining his P2 and P3. Then he says that Christ's will necessarily operated in constant conformity to God's will. I think that's what he means by being aligned with. That's from P4. And therefore, if you take these two ideas together, then the typical human will, since Christ's will is typical human will, necessarily operates in conformity to God's will. And if the human will necessarily operates in conformity to God's will, well, then taking these conclusions together, you would say that therefore the typical human will necessarily operates in conformity to God's will. When applied to Jesus, that would mean that Jesus always does the right thing because God he wants the man Jesus to always do the right thing. And of course, when applied to us, we do things like sin because God has been our will that we freely choose sin, whatever that might mean. I think this is the argument that Israel wants to have, and that Israel's trying to make based on the nature of Christ. If this is what he means, though, This is again an invalid argument. This is in the form Christ's will, which is all C is H, human will. All C, all is it necessarily operating in conformity to God will. But also all C is H, all C is G, therefore all H is G. That's the formal structure. This particular structure is called I'll let you guys Google this just as an FYI out there. I'm not expecting Drew to call this, but this in jargon is a figure 3 AAA form. This is a logical fallacy. This does not work. Look at the argument I have on screen. That's the exact same form. All cats are house pets. All cats are graceful. Therefore, all house pets are graceful. Well, clearly the conclusion doesn't follow, nor does it follow in Israel's case. This is an invalid argument. The reason it does not follow is because we're taking a specific thing, Christ's will, and illicitly jumping to a general thing, human wills. He has the order of distribution incorrect. So this is an invalid argument. It just doesn't work. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't further steelman his argument and try to fix it. This is how I would have made a valid version of his argument. And I think this is what he wanted to say, and he simply had an invalid approach to saying. I think he wanted to say this. There is no power that the human will has that Christ's will does not have. That's the same idea that's in P2 and P3, and that Christ's human will doesn't have the power of libertarian free will. I'm taking that from P5. Therefore, it would follow from this that human free will does not have the power of libertarian free will, libertarian freedom. Now, this is a valid argument. This is, if you guys want to see, that's the form all H are C, no C is L, therefore no H is L. This is, if you want the jargon, this is a figure 1 AEE. Feel free to look that up. This is a valid argument. The question is whether or not this P5 is true. Christ's human will does not have the power of libertarian freedom. Now, this is going to get me back. I would never have expected Drew to do this in the middle of a debate. However, I do think Drew should have really come down hard on P5. The way that Israel put it was, if Christ's human will necessarily is aligned to the divine will, then the Christ's human will was not free in the libertarian sense. Now, repeatedly in the debate, Israel admitted that this is the controversial premise. And given that very admission, Drew just should have just hammered it on. You're right, this is controversial, and we all just think that's false. Now, why should we think that it is true? Israel is going to give us 3 reasons to think that it's true. But before he does, he wants to set up a basic understanding of his terms. So it's good to always define your terms. But when you define your terms, you have to define your terms correctly. And this is, I think, the central problem that Israel's going to have. I'm not going to read everything on this page. By the way, let me say as an aside, if you have this much on your slide, that's a problem, because no one's going to take the time to read all of this, and people don't want you to read everything on your slide. But just look at the first sentence. If libertarian free will is true, one can't say we choose causally because of an influence. That's just false. That's not a proper understanding of libertarian free will. Now, it's not. I'm not going to end this video explaining what libertarian free will is. I just want to let you know that that's just not the libertarian claim. The libertarians believe that things cause us to choose things. There are different ways to assess that out, but as an Aristotelian, you have final causality. We choose for reasons. All I want to say right now is that whatever it is that Israel is arguing against is not at least the most common version of libertarian freedom. And when you go about making an argument, dear brothers and sisters, against a position, you have to work hard to make sure that you understand other people's positions. If this argument gets sent to me as a libertarian guy, a classical theist, but also libertarian, Chris, would you say that as a libertarian free will proponent that you can't choose causally because of an influence? I'd say no, Israel, you've misrepresented my view. You have to work hard to properly represent your opponents. And this problem is now going to come up over and over again. And this is a place that Drew could have just flat said, whatever you're attacking is not the libertarian position. Now, the first thing he's going to do is give a first of 3 arguments in favor of P5. He has an inductive argument. Now, this is just an invalid argument. Go back to my previous comments. There's nothing in the middle terms that connects this. But the idea, he's going to make a statistical argument. So there's millions and millions of choices we make. And notice the idea that given the sheer number of choices, even a tiny probability of choosing wrong makes it statistically near impossible Jesus would never have sinned. The assumption that's going to be explicit in two arguments from now that Israel making is that the decisions that libertarians imagine that choices are made at random. But that's a false assumption. Jesus can make the correct choices because he knows the correct choice, or he knows that of these three choices, any of these three would be correct. So this is just a false argument because this assumes that choices are made at random, and they're just not. So this just misrepresents the libertarian free will, which is what Drew should have just said. You just misrepresented the libertarian. Second of all, he has a deductive argument for premise 5. Now, this deductive argument is highly problematic. This is really going to boil down to heads I win, tails you lose. Notice he says in P1, any choice must originate in one of two ways. It has to follow an order or not. By itself, this is unclear. This is not the language libertarian people use or not. Then there's this suggested distinction between ordered and randomness, that if it's not ordered, it's random. But that's just obviously false. There are things that are random that still come out of an ordered process. And I'm not going to get into that. Just if you care, think about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It's highly ordered, even if it's truly random. And you can use something less detailed, like a coin flip, and setting aside epistemological issues. Random does not mean disordered. So, but more problematic than the lack of clarity. If the choice is ordered, it's not free will. If it's not ordered, it's not free will. You're actually not giving the libertarians a chance to even make their case what it is. You've just decided from the get-go that libertarian free will is false. This is heads I win, tails you lose. This is not taking your opponent position seriously. So the deductive argument is just false because suppose we grant 1 and I wouldn't, both 2 and 3 are false because that's not what this is a false dichotomy. That doesn't explain what free will actually is, which gets us to the point that I didn't get to go through, which is this abductive argument. The third position he started with. The abductive argument, I would strongly advise against abductive arguments because in order to do an abductive argument properly, you have to give all logical possibilities and then systematically rule them all out except yours. And in the process, he says he does that, and he just doesn't, because all Drew has to do, and this is one thing Drew should have done, is just give one philosophical coherent account of libertarian free will, and that account is not difficult to give. It's the human will is the agent of choice, and it is the efficient cause of a choice simply because God has given that power to be so. That is entirely coherent, and his arguments don't touch that particular claim. So then we come back to his argument. We've already seen that the Bible doesn't affirm the claim the Bible affirms determinism doesn't follow from the premises, so it's invalid. We've seen an argument that at least it's invalid as stated because it's built on a whole mode that's wrong. When I mentioned earlier, the figure 3 AAA form, but even charitably taken, the whole debate revolves around P5. And P5 is just false. Israel was able to give us no reason to think it's true. And where I think Drew could have done a little stronger, and I realize, again, Drew got lost in all the jargon, okay? I think you probably should have just focused on P5 in your cross-exam. And you probably should have just asked, why should I think that's true? I think that's one point that Drew could have pressed a little bit harder on. So, final thoughts on this argument and on the debate in general. I would say that in my assessment, Israel's argument as a whole was highly problematic, and Drew did a good job calling Israel out on poorly framing the issue and pointing out that it was difficult to follow. It's unclear. And as much as Israel may fuss about that, that's your job as a debater to put forward a clear argument that can be followed. It was logically invalid, and as they say, validity comes on the cheap, and even those things are easy to fix. It's really Israel's job to fix those things. What Drew could have done better, and again, Drew, you did a great job in the debate itself. What you should have done better is really in addition to calling out the validity issue, should have very practically hammered on the P5, because P5, by Israel's own admission, was the contention from the very beginning. And I would just encourage all of you in the audience, there's just no reason to think P5 is true. Just because Christ's will aligns with the divine, whatever that precisely means, doesn't mean that his will is determined. Christ can freely choose as a man to always do, or Christ's human will can always choose to do what it is the divine will would have. Just like in theory, we could as well. The problem with us is we choose to sin for a variety of reasons. Now, outside of that, we would have to get into a deep philosophical argument as to what is the nature of free will. And we can certainly have a debate on the nature of free will, and perhaps a debate for Donnie's channel might be, what is the nature of free will? But notice the question, the nature of free will is not the question that was being debated on Donnie's channel. That question was, is determinism biblical? And on that sense, I think Drew made his point. Let me say one final thought about the debate as a whole, which is, in addition to the structure of the argument itself and all the reasons I thought that was a mistake, there were no rebuttal periods. And rebuttals are important because had there been a rebuttal, I think Drew could have taken some uninterrupted time and gone through some of the points that I made. Also, what happened is in Drew's opening statement, he put forward 3 or 4 very straightforward, well-framed arguments in favor of biblical free will. And because there were no rebuttals, Israel never himself got a chance to respond, or did not take any opportunities to respond to Drew's arguments. What Israel chose to do in his cross exam was he went after, he pushed his own, he went back to his own argument and pushed it. And if you've seen my longer video from before, link in the description below, how to watch that. I mean, how to do cross exam, because he chose to press his own case rather than attacking Drew's position. And what happens is he implicitly concedes all 3 or 4 of the arguments that Drew made. So even if we were to say that Drew conceded Israel's problematic argument, what that means in the process is that Israel conceded all of Drew's arguments. When you have one argument against 3 or 4 arguments, well, the 3 or 4 arguments outweigh just from a scoring perspective. Final note, and this was very well addressed in the comments during the video, the comments after the video, and then the discussion was had on Facebook and other platforms otherwise. If you watch the cross exams in particular, but some comments even before the debate, the style in which you present yourself matters. And Israel, my brother, I want to tell you, you got to tone it back, man. Making snarky comments simply doesn't land well with the audience. We have to remember as debaters, but not only as debaters, you're out there, you're preaching a message. You have to remember who you're preaching to, who you're talking to. And if you talk in a way that pushes people away, you are probably not doing the right thing. We are not Jesus in John chapter 6, who encourages people to believe because Jesus knew they were doing the wrong thing. I suppose there's a theological argument to be made where I'm going to make the truth as hard to see as possible, but I would hope that that's not the stance that Israel was going for, the position. I hope that's not the position any of us choose to take when we have these. So when we have debates on this or any other channel amongst our friends on Facebook, on Twitter, on anywhere, when we're even just discussing theology, please make it a point to come across in a loving, caring way. Let no unwholesome word come out of your mouth. And even if you can't win the logic, at least win the moral victory, which is another place that Drew shined. So with that being said, I hope that you have found this video helpful. I hope you found it informative. And until the next time, may God richly bless you.